South African Youth Economic Council is a youth-led economic council in collaboration with the provincial government of KwaZulu-Natal. Will be hosting its inaugural Youth Economic Indaba in KwaMashu next week. The Indaba's theme is accelerating economic growth and investment in KZN to aid South Africa's economic and recovery plan. The aim of the gathering is to discuss the youth perspectives when it comes to the country's development path at large. So to take this discussion further, we're joined via Zoom by Sthandiwe Msomi, SAYEC National Spokesperson. Sthandiwe, good afternoon. Thanks for your time here on the SABC.
Afternoon, and thank you so much for having us.
Sthandiwe, one of the greatest challenges facing governments, policymakers in Africa, it's not even limited to South Africa alone today, is how to provide opportunities for the youth, more than 200 million youth on the continent, so that they can have decent lives, contribute to the economic development at large of their countries. Now, in lieu of this, what is the role of youth in forming, part of the KZN economic agenda and South Africa at large?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that the role of young people in formulating economic policy and plans and development is important because South Africa has a relatively young population, right? And when we talk about those who are mostly affected by youth unemployment, it is young people themselves. And you also find that we have a lot of young people who are going to universities and going to schools and acquiring the necessary skills to actually drive our economy forward. And so part of engaging with our leaders and stakeholders must involve the voices of young people, because it is the young people who come to SAYEC all the time with their business ideas and their business plans, or it is the young people who are the ones who have skills to drive innovation and growth in our country. And so I think in part of creating an environment such as the KZN Youth Economic Indaba, the objective in and of itself is to bring young people who are at KwaMashu and surrounding areas to engage with their leaders on what the bottlenecks are in them trying to start their businesses and them trying to enter specific sectors within KZN that hold a lot of economic opportunity. And I think once leaders are able to hear that from young people themselves, they can go back to the drawing board and amend whatever policy needs to be amended or create certain programs that speak to exactly what people, or young people rather, need.
You write about how economic growth is driven at a local level. And this is the first of a string of Indabas within the 9 provinces. I wonder if you could speak to the models that have been employed, perhaps the different scenarios to cater to the different areas and their different needs.
Yeah, so I mean, we know that the government has the district development model that tries to really create a synergy between national, provincial government, as well as municipalities for service delivery and job creation and a whole host of other economic imperatives. And while that plan exists, we found ourselves increasing the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And unfortunately, in South Africa, that gap itself can be seen in the geographic distribution of resources in South Africa, right? Mm-hmm. And so in bringing an economic indaba into an area like KwaMashu, the whole point of it is to engage young people who continue to be on the peripheries of the economy, and to take models like the district development model and various other plans that have been put in place, and to ask ourselves, why haven't we been able to see the job creation that these plans and models need to bring out in and of themselves? And that needs municipalities to look within themselves to see if their procurement policies are progressive to address youth unemployment. We also obviously need to look at other departments such as energy, because we've got an energy crisis, and the hardest hit businesses, unfortunately, are SMEs that just happen to be owned by young people. And so I think that part of the conversation that we're going to have at the Economic Indaba, as you talk about economic development and growing investments in KZN, we will also look at the different models that have been put in place and what amendments need to be made by the MEC, who's going to be present as well for economic development, Babsboniso Duma, need to be made to ensure that youth-owned businesses and young professionals and those who are unemployed actually have an opportunity in KZN, as opposed to having trying to migrate as well to other provinces such as Gauteng for opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at the socioeconomic and political environment in South Africa, it sincerely poses a great challenge to the youth of today. We're looking at issues of education, of training, of health at large. And this obviously impacts the future labor force of the country. I just want to very quickly look at the targeted measures to date that have been put in place to support youth development. We cannot ignore the strides that have been taken. How would you say we've fared on that front? And then perhaps as we look at what's been set, how do we improve? How do we fill those gaps? How effective are the policy measures then from here on to?
Yeah. So, I mean, the measures that have been put in place, I think if we look at something like the youth wage subsidy that National Treasury has put in place to try and give employers and companies an incentive to actually hire young people. Our policies that are great because businesses usually see labor as a cost to them, and so they just add it to their prices. But if there is a measure to decrease that cost for them as a way to try and increase the pool of young people who are employed, those policies would work. It's just unfortunate because in South Africa, SMMEs have a huge, a shorter lifespan than in other countries in and of themselves. And so we don't have enough youth-owned businesses or businesses in general that are growing to such a point where they are able to employ a lot of people and then actually utilize an incentive like the youth wage subsidy for companies. And so there needs to be a balancing act between trying to have these policies that will ensure that young people get employed, but also looking at the fundamentals. The fundamentals are broken. And if we go to a community like KwaMashu, you'll see that everything is under-resourced, from education to facilities for businesses. And so it doesn't create an enabling environment for young people who do want to start businesses to actually see themselves growing and achieving economies of scale and actually being able to employ people. And so we need to look back at the fundamentals to ask ourselves, what investments does government need to make in local communities themselves so that people are actually given a step forward as opposed to having to start from scratch. And also we need to explore other interesting avenues in terms of policy and ways of increasing investments in youth-owned businesses, such as looking at joint ventures between small businesses as well as corporates as a way to try and integrate youth-owned businesses into critical supply chains in our country. And I mean, KZN has a huge construction sector. It's got a huge logistics and transportation sector, given the ports that we have. And there's so many youth-owned businesses that approach us asking what are opportunities that companies like Transnet and other companies, that will be present at the Indaba itself. And so looking at how we can explore that, joint ventures, looking at venture capital as well to fund youth-owned businesses. All of those mechanisms haven't been thoroughly exploited in South Africa, and I think we need to find different measures rather to be able to see those alternative avenues increase the investment that we need.
Sthandiwe is certainly the first of many set to take place around the country. Let's leave the conversation there. Thank you very much for your time and for those insights. Sthandiwe Msomi, SAYEC National Spokesperson. South African Youth Economic Council is obviously leading the Economic Indaba in collaboration with the provincial government in KwaZulu-Natal, hosting the inaugural Youth Economic Indaba in KwaMashu next week, really just focusing on the role of youth in economic recovery. Not limited to KZN, it will start in KZN, perhaps the ripple effects also to be seen across the country. Again, thank you to her for her time.